Traditionally, the Golden Triangle region, the borders of Thailand, Laos and Myanmar, has been notorious for the cultivation of opium and the production of heroin. But, since 1950s, the Golden Crescent, which comprising of Afghanistan, Iran and Pakistan has replaced Golden Triangle to be the world's largest drug production area. At the peak of its opium production in 2007, the Golden Crescent produced more than 8,000 of the world's almost 9,000 total tons of opium, a near monopoly. Afghanistan, a desperately poor, the war-ravaged country, has been the world's leading illicit drug producer since 2001. Afghanistan's opium poppy harvest produces more than 90% of illicit heroin globally, and more than 95% of the European supply. Estimates made in 2006 by the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime estimate that 52% of the nation's GDP, amounting to $2.7 billion annually, is generated by the drug trade. In fact, drug trade has been an integral part of Afghanistan's state-building process. Afghanistan first began producing opium in significant quantities in the mid-1950s to supply its neighbor Iran after poppy cultivation was banned there. Afghanistan and Pakistan increased production and became major suppliers of opiates to Western Europe and North America in the mid-1970s, when political instability combined with a prolonged drought disrupted supplies from the Golden Triangle. It is no coincidence that Afghanistan began to emerge as a significant producer of illicit opium in precisely the period of protracted war, which began in 1979 and still persists. In December 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. It fought a resistance movement that was supported by the US, Pakistan, China and Saudi Arabia, among other countries. A number of resistance leaders were using the production and sale of opium to finance their operation. An increasingly structured and formalized economic system grew for this nascent drugs for arms trade. Opium was one of the only commodities which could generate enough income for large-scale arms purchases. It was alleged by the Soviets that U.S. Central Intelligence Agency, CIA agents were helping smuggle opium out of Afghanistan, either into the West, in order to raise money for the Afghan resistance, or into the Soviet Union, in order to weaken it through drug addiction. Between 1979 and 1989, regular agricultural production was severely disrupted. About one-third of the all farms were abandoned. Between one-half to two-thirds of all villages were bombed, between one-quarter to one-third of the country's irrigation systems were destroyed, and the amount of livestock fell by 70%. There were also severe depopulation in the rural parts of the country. During the Soviet period, some 9% of the Afghan population were killed, another 3% fled to the country, 11% became internal refugees, and many heading to the urban centers. By the late 1980s, the breakdown of any form of governance in Afghanistan resulted in weakening of social and legal constraints on the cultivation of opium poppy. While at various points in its history the cultivation of opium poppy was actually forbidden under Islam, this did not prevent people from cultivating it. Economic considerations were often given priority over religious customs. The acceptance of the agricultural tax, by mullahs and the local authorities, was often interpreted by farmers and itinerant workers as implicit support for the cultivation of opium poppy. Though a large amount of roads and transport infrastructure had been destroyed by the fighting, the various factions had a direct interest in maintaining those necessary for the opium trade, giving opium a market of increasingly viability while markets for other crops continued to be underdeveloped. Between 1972 and the early 1980s, three main sources of opium production, Iran, Pakistan and Turkey, were enforcing bans or severe drug control laws, creating an opening for other sources of opium in Southwest Asia. In the 1980s, the trend became clear. Just as internal factors were leading to an upswing in Afghan opium production, external factors were opening major markets, ensuring the economic viability of its production. Afghanistan's major role in the global production of opium thus became established during this period. By 1989, the opium production in Afghanistan reached 1,200 tons and was 35% of global production, had firmly established itself in the country as a major source of income generation. Over 10 years, opium production had effectively been included in the livelihood strategies of individual farmers, itinerant laborers and rural communities. In 1989, Soviet troops withdrew but the civil war continued. Various factions started fighting against each other for power. With the discontinuation of Western support, they resorted ever more to poppy cultivation to finance their military existence. The average annual growth rate for the production of opium in Afghanistan was 14% between 1979 and 1989. It accelerated to 19% between 1989 and 1994. In the chaos that followed in 1994, the Taliban sprang up. Between 1996, when the Taliban took control of most of Afghanistan, and the year 1999, opium production doubled in the country, equivalent to an average annual growth rate of 27%. Besides collected agricultural tax, usually 10%, and zakat, usually 20%, from the farmers, the Taliban also received taxes from the opium traders. There are also indications that some of the local Taliban commanders and mullahs were personally involved in the opium trade. Even more important, a number of warlords, who were already involved in the opium trade, surrendered to the Taliban in exchange for the promise to continue with their lucrative opium business. Both the Taliban and various groups fighting against them benefited from opium poppy cultivation and trade. However, as most of the opium-producing areas were under Taliban control, the largest profits out of opium were also reaped by the Taliban. Opium itself is durable and commanded a higher price on average. This makes it a precious commodity in situations of severely damaged transport infrastructure. It is estimated that nearly 60% of Afghanistan's road network was destroyed during the conflict. What distinguishes opium from perishable product is the fact that, even when roads are destroyed, the investment in poppy cannot be jeopardized by longer travel times to the market. Also, fresh opium can be retained and stocked by farmers and sold later as dry opium. The product itself gave farmers crucial collateral to use for access to credit and investment. With no formal credit system in place in Afghanistan, opium is used by the landless in Afghanistan to obtain basic human needs, such as food, clothes, and medicine. Amongst the wealthier and land-owning groups, it is used to facilitate productive investment in agricultural production, not only for opium poppy but other crops as well. The different types of informal credit system operating in opium-growing regions would include the advance sale of a fixed amount of agricultural production, the delayed payment for commodities from shopkeepers, and interest-free loans. A significant number of households in Afghanistan obtain advance payments, known as salam, on future agricultural production, including opium, wheat, and black cumin. In the poppy-growing district, majority of farmers receive advance payment for opium crop. This mainly due to the nature of the crop itself. Opium crop is a very dependable crop. In times of drought, for example, it is considered to be more dependable than wheat or black cumin. Because of this, opium is considered by many to be the optimal crop for recourse to credit. The expansion of opium poppy cultivation over the last 2 decades is also related to the absence of non-farm income opportunities in the country. A large portion of economy of Afghanistan has always been agriculturally based, with a large portion of it taking place at the subsistence level. However, even the agricultural sector is structurally weak, largely due to the absence or destruction of appropriate infrastructure and the lack of any significant development. Due to fear of international isolation, in July 2000, Taliban Supreme Leader, collaborating with the United Nations to eradicate heroin production in Afghanistan, declared that growing poppies was un-Islamic, resulting in one of the world's most successful anti-drug campaigns. The Taliban enforced a ban on poppy farming via threats, forced eradication, and public punishment of transgressors. The result was a 99% reduction in the area of opium poppy farming in Taliban-controlled areas, roughly 3/4 of the world's supply of heroin at the time. The ban was effectively only briefly due to deposition of the Taliban in 2002. Though the Taliban successfully implemented the ban, they had not offered any alternatives to the farmers. This caused extreme hardship to a significant number of farmers in a year in which Afghanistan was experiencing a severe drought and thus very poor yields for other crops. Overall crop production was more than halved and livestock herds were heavily depleted, erasing the gains made since the mid-1990s. The ban in combination with the ongoing drought meant that malnutrition worsened and cases of starvation deaths were reported. However, some suggest that certain parties benefited from the price increase during the ban. Some even believe it was a form of market manipulation on the part of certain drug traders. Dried opium, unlike most agricultural products, can easily be stored for long periods, without refrigeration or other expensive equipment. With huge stashes of opium stored in secret hideaways, the Taliban and other groups that were involved in the drug trade were in theory able to make huge personal profits during the price spikes after the 2000 ban and the chaos following the September 11 attacks. November 2001, and with the start of the Afghan war, the collapse of the economy and the scarcity of other sources of revenue forced many of the country's farmers to resort to growing opium for export. In December 2001, a number of prominent Afghans met in Bonn, Germany, under United Nations auspices to develop a plan to re-establish the state of Afghanistan. Afghanistan subsequently implemented its new constitution and held national elections. On December 7, 2004, Hamid Karzai was formally sworn in as president of a democratic Afghanistan. Corrupt officials may have undermined the government's enforcement efforts. Afghan farmers claimed that government officials take bribes for turning a blind eye to the drug trade while punishing poor opium growers. Another obstacle to getting rid of poppy cultivation in Afghanistan is the reluctant collaboration between U.S. forces and Afghan warlords in hunting drug traffickers. In the absence of the Taliban, the warlords largely control the opium trade but are also highly useful to U.S. forces in scouting, providing local intelligence, keeping their own territories clean from al-Qaeda and Taliban insurgents, and even taking part in military operations. While U.S. and allied efforts to combat the drug trade have been stepped up, the effort is hampered by the fact that many suspected drug traffickers then became top officials in the Karzai government. The rise in production has been linked to the deteriorating security situation, as production is markedly lower in areas with stable security. By some, the extermination of the poppy crops is not seen as a viable option because the sale of poppies constitutes the livelihood of Afghanistan's rural farmers. Some 3.3 million Afghans are involved in producing opium. Opium is more profitable than wheat, and destroying opium fields could possibly lead to discontent or unrest among the indigent population. Some poppy eradication programs have, however, proven effective, especially in the north of Afghanistan. Opium production is protected by the government of Hamid Karzai as well as by the Taliban, as all parties to political conflict in Afghanistan, as well as criminals, benefit from opium production. The U.S. military turns a blind eye to opium production, as not being central to its anti-terrorism mission. On October 28, 2010, agents of Russia's Federal Service for the Control of Narcotics joined Afghan and U.S. anti-drug forces in an operation to destroy a major drug production site near Jalalabad. In the operation, 932 kilograms of high-quality heroin and 156 kilograms of opium, with a street value of $250 million and a large amount of technical equipment was destroyed. This was the first anti-drug operation to include Russian agents. Hamid Karzai called the operation a violation of Afghan sovereignty and international law. Afghanistan has accounted for about 84% of global opium production over the past 5 years. Despite a cultivation decline in 2018 due to low prices and drought, the country's opium production has increased rapidly and consistently since 2001 and has remained stable at high levels in 2019 and into 2020. While Afghanistan's opiate economy shrunk by 2/3 between 2017 and 2018, it was still 6% to 11% of the country's GDP and exceeded the value of the country's official legal exports of goods and services. One thing is for certain: Afghanistan's drug problem is not going away anytime soon. It's hard to imagine the Afghan economy without the drug trade. For much of the Afghan rural population, revenue from illicit crops is an essential source of basic livelihood and economic security. It's not just about drug baron profits. Large segments of the rural population in Afghanistan would face economic immiseration without the illicit market. In short, the illicit drug economy exacerbates insecurity, strengthens corruption, produces macroeconomic distortions, and contributes to a vast increase in drug use and addiction in Afghanistan. But it also provides a vital economic lifeline for many Afghans and enhances their human security. It thus produces political capital for those who sponsor opium poppy cultivation, and it is politically explosive for those who sponsor eradication.